Hello class, this week we're going to be focusing on chapter 3 with an overview on culture. Before we get started, I want you to think about how you would define American culture. What kind of values define our American society? The picture on this slide may give you some ideas like freedom, equality, rights, patriotism, diversity, security, etc. And if you click on that PDF file on the bottom of this slide, that file goes a little bit further by listing 101 characteristics of culture in the United States. Some of the cultural values listed here include independence, individualism, freedom of choice, and personal space. But some other cultural characteristics that might not first come to your mind listed in this file are Americans like to smile a lot. They're very expressive with their emotions. There's also, connected to smiling a lot, this emphasis on personal happiness. Americans at the same time are known for kind of restraining their emotions. In the United States, there's a lot of glorification of youth and beauty, and there's emphasis on cleanliness and smelling good. And although we might think of those things as kind of pretty general, these are not cultural traits that you find in every society. Not every society glorifies youth and beauty. Not every society puts a huge emphasis on smiling or personal happiness. And not every society is as obsessive with cleanliness and smelling good as the United States is. Now, what is culture and how is it different from society? We can define culture as the shared beliefs, values, behaviors, and practices that participants must learn. Rules and expectations are created by society and then enforced by people who interact and share a culture. On the other hand, we can define a society as a group of people who share a community, or they live within some sort of definable region, and they also share a culture. So if you think about the two definitions, while society and culture are defined differently, they are certainly interdependent. One doesn't exist without the other. So almost every human behavior, from shopping to smiling to marriage to the ways that we express our feelings, is learned. So on the next several slides, we're going to take a look at culture through more of an international lens and look at the work of social psychologist Geert Hofstede. And his work will help us to understand some of the primary cultural differences that define societies around the world. So Geert Hofstede worked at IBM in the 1970s as a management trainer. And because IBM had offices and managers from all over the world, especially in the 1970s, Hofstede started to notice the differences in cultural values that were being exhibited by the beliefs and the behaviors of the managers that he was working with. So he decided to develop a research project based on this observation, and he founded the IBM Personnel Research Department. Now, as part of that research department, Hofstede created and distributed a questionnaire survey to over 100,000 people from around the world in order to analyze cross-cultural differences at an international level. As a result of his survey, Hofstede and his research associates concluded that there were 6 primary cultural dimensions that particularly affect the way that members of societies act, believe, organize, and interpret their social world. So we're going to take a brief look at those 6 cultural dimensions that they came up with. The first cultural dimension is referred to as power distance. And this dimension measures the cultural attitude regarding inequality and hierarchical power in society. So each dimension that we're going to talk about is measured on a scale between 0 and 100. And so a low score of, say, 15 for power distance would mean that a society does not generally approve of inequality. But a high score of 85 or 90 would indicate that a culture is generally accepting of inequality. Then the second cultural dimension they came up with is referred to as individualism. And this dimension measures whether a society is more collectivist or more individualistic. In other words, do members of the society think more in terms of we, or do they think more in terms of I and me? So a low score of 15 on this measurement would indicate that the culture is very collectivist and emphasizes interdependence, whereas a high score of 85 would show that a culture is more individualistic and emphasizes independence. So the third cultural dimension is referred to as masculine or feminine. Hofstede associated, quote, masculine societies with cultural values like competition, achievement, success, and a mentality that there are winners and there are losers. On the other hand, he associated, quote, feminine societies with those that emphasize caring and cooperation over competition. So on this one, a low score of 15 would indicate the society embraces, quote, feminine values, while a high score of 85 suggests that the society emphasizes, quote, masculine values. Then the fourth cultural dimension here is uncertainty avoidance. And this dimension measures the extent to which a society tries to control their environment and society in order to avoid uncertain or risky situations. So for uncertainty avoidance, a low score of like 15 would indicate that a society is more accepting of the unknown and the unpredictable and are more likely to accept change. On the other hand, a high score of, say, 85 would show that a society prefers to stay as close to the status quo and traditional ways of doing things as possible. This type of society does not like the idea of change and tries to avoid that anxiety of uncertainty as much as possible. Then the fifth cultural dimension is referred to as long-term orientation. This dimension measures whether a society's members orient their life and actions around a consistent belief that they are connected with the past and the future. This kind of society analyzes each action or decision in light of what repercussions or effects their actions may have on generations of people to come. So a high score of 85 on long-term orientation would indicate a society has a strong emphasis on these long-term planning and goals. On the other hand, a lower score of, say, 15 would indicate that a society is more oriented toward short-term goals and tends to think more about the here and now. And then that final cultural dimension at the bottom is referred to as indulgence. So this dimension differentiates cultures according to whether they are accepting of indulgences or whether or not they emphasize the enjoyment of life and the importance of leisure. Or, on the other hand, if they tend to be more restrained or disciplined and discourage leisure and the gratification of personal desires. So a high score of 85 on indulgence would indicate that a society is accepting of indulgences and promotes personal happiness and leisure time, while a low score of 15 would suggest the society is more restrained when it comes to pursuing personal enjoyment. Now, although Geert Hofstede passed away earlier this year in 2020, his work on studying cross-cultural international differences is carried on by a research institute called Hofstede Insights. The link that I have here on this slide will take you to the website for Hofstede Insights. And on the website, you'll see a search bar come up where you can enter any countries that they've studied in their database into your search field and look at the different cultural differences between selected countries according to those 6 cultural dimensions. I went to the website and searched for a cultural comparison of the United States and Japanese culture. So on the next few slides, we'll go over some of those key differences according to these Hofstede's 6 cultural dimensions. So the graphic on this slide is the result of my search from that Hofstede Insights website. The graph breaks down each cultural dimension for Japan and the United States side by side here for easy comparison. Notice that the blue bars represent Japanese culture and the purple bars represent United States culture. So all the way to the left here is the cultural dimension of power distance. And remember, a higher score indicates more acceptance of social inequality and strict hierarchy. And the chart above indicates that Japanese culture is slightly more accepting of inequality and hierarchy than US culture. So Japan had 54 and US scored at a 40. Next, we have the cultural dimension of individualism. So a higher score indicates an emphasis on individualism, while a lower score indicates an emphasis on collectivism. So you can see the US has a very high score on individualism at 91 out of 100, and Japan has a lower score of 46. So the US obviously is a culture that emphasizes individualism, and Japan is a bit more of a collectivist society. Now, the next cultural dimension is masculinity versus femininity. Remember, the higher scores indicate a cultural emphasis on competition, achievement, and a mentality of winners versus losers, while a low score here indicates more of an emphasis on caring and cooperation. Now, both the US and Japan have scores above 50, so they are both qualified as more masculine or more competitive societies in terms of cultural values, but you'll notice Japan's score is significantly higher at 95 compared to the US at 62. And the next cultural dimension is that uncertainty avoidance. A higher score, like Japan's score of 92, suggests that Japanese culture tries to stick with tradition and avoid change as much as possible, while a lower score, like the US score of 46, indicates that US culture is more accepting of change. And then the fifth cultural dimension, let me highlight here, is long-term orientation. So a higher score, again, suggests that society is more oriented toward long-term perspectives and goals. They think in terms of generations rather than years or decades. Japanese culture represents a very strong association with long-term orientation with a score of 88, while the US score of 26, which is the lowest score on this comparison chart, indicates that US culture is much more oriented toward the here and now and the immediate situations that face society. And lastly, the final cultural dimension is indulgence. A higher score, like the US score of 68, indicates the culture is largely accepting of leisure time, taking the time to enjoy life, while a lower score, like Japan's score of 42, suggests that Japanese culture is a bit more focused on productivity and self-discipline instead of enjoyment and leisure. So that's just the results of my search between Japan and the United States. But I encourage you to visit that website from a few slides earlier. You can enter in any country that you can think of and into that Hofstede Insights website and look to see how other cultures compare with the US along the lines of these 6 cultural dimensions. So now we're going to turn to focus on material and non-material culture. So material culture refers to objects or belongings of a group of people. So objects or belongings, something that kind of exists for the most part physically in our society. So some examples would be a bus pass or an automobile, a store, a restaurant, a cell phone, your church or synagogue or place of worship, artwork, clothing, sports, cuisine, books, films, etc. So when we refer to material culture, it's something important to the society, but it's also something that you can generally see or hear or touch or smell or taste. On the other hand, non-material culture refers to the ideas, attitudes, and beliefs of a society. Some examples are a society's economic structure, capitalism, feudalism, communism, or a society's religious doctrine, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, or Buddhism. Non-material culture can refer to kind of political structure and ideals like democratic, totalitarian, monarchical, or dictatorship. Non-material culture can also refer to language, education, and the law. So in short, material culture can be sensed in the physical world, while non-material culture exists in our minds. So objects of material culture embody or symbolize the non-material culture of the society. So what do I mean by that? Please take a few minutes to watch this short video on this slide. It unveils many aspects of non-material culture, and this gentleman here is specifically he uses the American Happy Meal from McDonald's and takes each object or toy or piece of food or drink that's part of that American Happy Meal, and he really breaks it down and talks about kind of all those ideas and attitudes that the material culture of, say, a hamburger or a Coca-Cola represents. So this gentleman in the video starts out by asking, what does the Happy Meal tell us about American culture? The Happy Meal represents an object of material culture, but what kind of beliefs, values, and ideas are communicated by way of the Happy Meal? Now, sometimes material culture and non-material culture do not align. In other words, some objects that are introduced into a society are not accepted immediately by the people. And this is because the use of the particular object may require a change to the non-material culture, or a change to the society's commonly held ideas, beliefs, and attitudes. So the term that we use to describe this phenomenon is culture lag. So we define culture lag as the time that elapses or passes between the introduction of a new item of material culture and its acceptance as part of non-material culture. So material culture tends to change quickly. Think of how fast technology changes, especially nowadays. So material culture changes quickly while non-material culture resists change. It's a lot easier to introduce a new cell phone that's going to go on the market than it is to change the ideas and attitudes of everyone in a society. So a society's objects and ideas can cause not just generational, but cultural gaps. Material culture, again, it tends to diffuse or spread more quickly than non-material culture. For example, a new technology spreads through society in a matter of months, but it can take generations for ideas, beliefs, and attitudes of that society to change. So let's think about two examples of culture lag by looking at two instances when a new piece of material culture was introduced, but the society's non-material culture took a little bit of time to catch up and fully accept those new cultural objects. So one example would be the cell phone. When cell phones were first introduced, there was a slow transition of people becoming more and more accepting of this transition from the traditional landline telephone in your home to a portable cell phone that was always on you. A lot of people refused to make that transition at first and didn't understand why they, quote, needed to have a phone on them at all times. It just wasn't part of the way of life. After all, most American households had a voicemail machine, so if people were calling them, they could leave a voicemail and people could return the missed calls. So a lot of people really didn't understand or accept the cell phone at first. A lot of people even continued to carry beepers instead of transfer to a cell phone if anyone needed to reach them quickly. And especially early on, cell phones were mostly kind of relegated for the rich, the richest people in society. Not everyone had them the way it is today. So it took time for that piece of material culture, the cell phone, to kind of spread through society to the point where people started to accept the need, quote unquote, need to have a cell phone, which is representative of non-material culture. that idea, that attitude that you always have to have a phone on you, needed to develop and grow. Another example is the invention of the zipper. So when the zipper was first invented, a lot of people were not really comfortable with having these interlocking metal parts so close to their skin and so close to that area of their body, perhaps, if it was a zipper on pants. And a lot of people preferred to continue wearing clothes that had button fasteners rather than a zipper. It was only after newspapers and fashion magazines and actors and influential people in society started to advertise and promote the benefits and conveniences of using a zipper fastener that Americans started to buy more clothes with zippers and kind of move away from buttons. So again, the zipper is that piece of material culture. It's a physical invention, but people didn't accept it from the get-go. It took time for society to accept the zipper into their non-material culture, to the point now where if you went and bought a pair of pants and it had a button fastener on it, you would think that was kind of abnormal or strange. Nowadays we expect zippers to be on our clothing. So neither the zipper nor the cell phone were immediately accepted into the mainstream of society. However, over time, those conveniences and the benefits of cell phones and zippers were actively promoted and advertised, and eventually they caught on throughout the general public. And both of these inventions of material culture have now been fully accepted into the non-material culture of U.S. society. Now on this slide, I've put 7 examples of material culture in the United States. So we've got a Big Mac meal from McDonald's, a package of birth control pills, the American Dictionary of the English Language, a church, the Constitution, the NFL Sports League, and Walmart. So what kind of non-material culture do you think is reflected by these examples of material culture? In other words, what kind of cultural ideas, attitudes, and beliefs are reflected by the examples on this slide? There are a lot of possible answers to these questions, but I'll just list some of the most popular ones here that my students in past lecture classes have volunteered and come up with during classes. So first we have the material culture of the McDonald's Big Mac meal. And if you watch that video from a couple slides back, you should be well prepared to answer this part. So we can think of the Big Mac meal as embodying American values such as speed or uniformity, the fact that you can go to any McDonald's in this country and your Big Mac meal is supposed to taste the same and look the same. That's uniformity. Convenience, being able to grab your dinner within 5 minutes and go home. Not have to cook or wait at a restaurant where it takes 20 minutes to prepare your meal. It's more convenient and more quick. And an emphasis on quantity over quality. So I think we can all admit McDonald's is probably not the healthiest place to eat, but you do get your bang for your buck there. So the material culture of a package of birth control pills. What kind of ideas and beliefs in our culture do you think a pack of birth control pills, or really any medicine, embodies? So we can think, particularly if we think about birth control pills, it embodies a cultural kind of attitude or faith in science and medicine. Depending on what side you fall on, birth control pills may signify a belief that women should be able to control their bodies and possess that autonomy to choose whether or not they want to procreate. While on the other hand, for other people, birth control pills might signify a violation of Judeo-Christian values and an interpretation that birth control is an attempt to, quote, play God, so to speak. So there's kind of two different paths of attitudes and beliefs that we can take when we look at a pack of birth control pills. Then we have the American Dictionary of the English Language. So what kind of non-material culture do you think that the dictionary, the piece of material culture of the dictionary, represents or embodies? We can think of an American Dictionary of the English Language embodying cultural values like standardization, uniformity, an emphasis on written records instead of, say, some societies don't put so much emphasis on writing everything down and recording things. And it can also, of course, convey a cultural belief that Americans should speak English. Then we have the material culture of a church or a place of worship. Now, the material culture of the church embodies, this one might be a little bit easier, it embodies values associated with your faith in God and Christianity. A church may represent beliefs that communities benefit and become stronger when they share a common faith. So those are kind of these underlying ideas that a physical structure of the church embodies and represents. Then we have the Constitution. So the Constitution, as a piece of parchment, is a piece of material culture. It exists in the world as an object. But the material culture of the Constitution represents American cultural values like liberty, equality, and justice. You don't have to sit down and read the Constitution every time you see it. You can just see this picture of the Constitution, the physical material object, and almost immediately associate it with certain ideas and values of American culture and society. So the Constitution also embodies the American belief that citizens should be guaranteed personal rights, like the right to vote and protest and speak freely and bear arms. Then we have the National Football League. So the National Football League, as a piece of material culture, represents American ideals of both teamwork and competition. It embodies a cultural belief that there are winners and losers. And it represents American attitudes that seek heroes or goats, greatest of all times, to glorify and aspire to be. And lastly, we have the physical building, the structure, that material culture of the Walmart. So the material culture of Walmart, or a Walmart store, embodies American values like convenience. Again, you can go to one store and get everything you need. Speed, uniformity. Again, if you go in a Walmart in Columbus, Georgia and a Walmart in Schenectady, New York, you're probably going to find very similar store layout and very similar products. So uniformity, predictability. A lot of Walmart stores are actually laid out and designed to have the same exact store design. So you can go into a Walmart and know that you're going to find the pet section to the right at the far corner. And if you go to another Walmart in a different state, you most likely can turn right, go to the far corner, and find that pet food. So predictability, again, that quantity over quality. There are quality products at Walmart, but by and large, it's a place that you go to spend to get a good deal, to buy something for less money than you might spend somewhere else. And of course, it represents certain ideas like capitalism and values of American culture, as well as a cultural belief that owning more things leads to happiness. Now let's turn really quickly and look at some cultural universals. So while Hofstede, Geert Hofstede, who we talked about those 6 cultural dimensions, so while Hofstede was concerned with studying the many cultural differences across the world, another sociologist named George Murdoch was more interested in studying what cultural patterns and traits are common to all societies around the world. So Murdoch studied cultures and societies around the world and called the following aspects, he called them common cultural values or cultural universals. So the cultural universals that Murdoch found were, number 1, the provision of basic needs. In other words, all societies emphasize the importance of providing shelter, food, and clothing to their members. Number 2, we have the family unit. And families have an important role in all societies. Though the form of the family may differ, for example, some societies tend to have larger extended families, and other societies have smaller nuclear families. But the role of the family unit, regardless of what form it takes, is to regulate reproductive and sexual behavior, educate children, and provide for and protect dependents. And third, we have beliefs. So all societies share some common set of beliefs that orient their lives. These beliefs might be represented by funeral rites, celebrations of birth, folklore and tradition, or religious rituals. Then number 4, we have technology. All societies exhibit some sort of tendency to develop technology in order to make life easier, though the level of technology might differ. So for example, a simple tool like a hammer, as well as advanced medicinal research, can both be referred to as technology. Then we have arts and leisure. So all societies practice some form of creativity or sportsmanship. So all societies have some form of art and sport. Then we have government and the economy. So all societies function based on some sort of organizational structure for governance and for trade and production. And lastly, the last cultural universal is language. So all societies communicate with each other using some form of a shared language. Most societies give personal names to their members, and notably, Murdoch found that one of the most prevalent cultural universals is humor and jokes. So he claimed that humor is a universal way to relieve tensions and to create a sense of unity among a people. Now, this slide contains several important definitions for this chapter and for the rest of this course. So we'll begin with ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is defined as evaluating or judging another culture based on how it compares to your own cultural norms. So ethnocentrism represents a belief or attitude that one's own culture is better than everyone else's. So while ethnocentrism can lead to very violent and drastic results, a couple more benign examples of ethnocentrism would be when an American says that someone from England is driving on the, quote, wrong side of the road. In other words, by saying that that person is driving on the wrong side, the implication is that Americans drive on the right or correct side of the road. Another common example that represents ethnocentric thinking is when people refer to parts of Asia as the, quote, Far East, because the full reference implies that parts of Asia are geographically defined only in relation to the Western world. In other words, far east of where? What's your reference point? So if ethnocentrism goes unchecked, it is possible it can lead to something we call cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism refers to the deliberate imposition of a society's cultural values on another culture. So forcing another culture to adapt and change change their beliefs and attitudes in order to mirror another culture. So one notable example of cultural imperialism would be the common practice of European colonization during the 16th century. On the other hand, we have the term xenocentrism, which is almost the complete opposite of ethnocentrism. So xenocentrism refers to the tendency to value goods and culture or even ideas from a country other than one's own as better. So if you remember a couple years ago, the media frenzy that surrounded this woman named Rachel Dolezal. She was a white woman who ran a NAACP office while presenting herself as a black woman and claiming that she identified as a black woman. And when this was found out, it became this big kind of fiasco, and you really couldn't turn on the news without hearing about this woman, Rachel Dolezal, who was white, but kind of presented and interpreted herself apparently as identifying as a black woman. And during a lot of those interviews with Rachel Dolezal, she often remarked that she always felt more aligned with and admired Black American culture growing up. And so she claims that white culture, quote unquote, never appealed to her. So why do I bring her up? Because she's a pretty recent and fairly well-known example of a representation of this term, xenocentrism. She valued another culture as better than her own, say. And then we have another term, cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the practice of assessing a culture by its own standards rather than viewing another society through the lens of your own culture. So the reading from Chapter 1 on the sociological imagination is essentially an argument in favor of cultural relativism. Cultural relativism requires an open mind, not being judgmental, doing your best to not be judgmental, and a willingness to consider and even adapt to new values and norms. Now, you've probably heard the term culture shock before, but what exactly does it mean? Culture shock happens when you're confronted with another culture that's drastically different from your own. And ethnocentrism can be so strong in some people that when we're confronted with all the differences of a new culture, we might experience some disorientation or frustration. So as people experience a lot of these unanticipated differences from their own culture, the initial excitement about being exposed to a new society or culture can give way to feelings of discomfort or doubts about how to behave appropriately in this new situation. The video embedded on this slide was produced by Asian students who are trying to help other Asian students navigate culture shock when they move to the US to attend college. And some of the aspects of American culture that they note when discussing culture shock are greeting friends with a hug. That's not something that they say typically happens in Asian societies, but is pretty common in the United States. They talk about the enormous sizes and saltiness of American food, the practice of tipping at restaurants. They talk about the fact that class participation is very much encouraged in the U.S., while it's not as much so in Asian cultures. They talk about the casualness of American students' clothing when they go to classes. They talk about the fact that Americans always drink cold water or ice water. And they remark that it's not appropriate for American friends to walk around holding hands because holding hands is reserved for couples in the U.S. So those are just a few things that they talk about in this video. I think it's under 10 minutes long, so you can give that a look. It's also posted on Blackboard just to get a better idea of culture shock. Now, the two basic elements of a culture are values and beliefs. Beliefs refer to the tenets or convictions that an individual holds to be true. On the other hand, values represent a culture's standard for determining what is good and just in the society. So beliefs are individual and personal, while values are collective and shared. And it's important to note that values portray an ideal culture. Values suggest how people in a society are expected to or should behave, but they don't necessarily accurately reflect how all people do actually behave. So for example, it's easy to value good health, but it's hard to actually quit going to McDonald's, or it's hard to actually quit smoking or go on a diet. Another example is while monogamy, being faithful to your spouse, is certainly valued in society, many spouses still engage in infidelity. Again, cultural diversity and equal opportunities for all people are valued in the United States, yet the country's highest political offices are still really dominated by white men. So there's your cultural values, and values portraying an ideal culture, something to aspire to, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those values end up coming to fruition in reality. So individuals in society can have their individual beliefs, but they also share collective values with others in their society. For example, the individual belief in the American dream is based upon the collective American value that personal wealth is good and important, or the individual belief that a person should pull themselves up by their bootstraps is based upon American values of individual independence and social mobility. So the sociologist Wayne Baker claimed that Americans share 10 core values, and those are listed over here in this graphic. So these 10 core values, he said, that all Americans share is 1, respect and acceptance of others; 2, symbolic patriotism, or as he described it, an emotional connection to the country; 3, freedom; 4, security; 5, individualism and self-reliance; 6, equal opportunity and equal access; 7, getting ahead, so things like individual achievement and status and success; 8, the pursuit of happiness, so a little bit of that emphasis on enjoyment and leisure and pleasure; 9, justice and fairness, so rule of law, personal rights; and 10 is what he called critical patriotism, which is the desire to constantly improve the country. So again, values represent kind of this ideal that we want to strive for. So just because he came up with these 10 values doesn't mean we see these values enacted every day in society, but they are things that generally most Americans would agree that we should aspire to these things or values. So, how do societies encourage members to internalize those ideal values? The answer is sanctions. So sanctions can also be thought of as rewards and punishments. Sanctions are the means by which societies transform those ideal values into action. Sanctions are a form of social control that encourages conformity to the cultural values, and sanctions can be positive or negative. So some positive sanctions are rewards for good behavior or successfully upholding the values of society. So some examples of positive sanctions would be receiving a good grade, receiving a promotion at work for your hard work, or applause from your peers. And some negative sanctions are punishments for bad behavior or failing to uphold societal values. So an example of a negative sanction would be you receiving an F on a test if your teacher found out that you cheated, or being fired from a job, receiving gossip or ridicule from your peers, or being given a speeding ticket. So all of those are examples of negative sanctions. Now, social norms define how to behave in accordance with what a society has defined as good, just, and important. So most people in society adhere to social norms, and those that don't cause a lot of discomfort to the other people around them. Cultural norms play a crucial role in our day-to-day existence. Norms let us know how to behave around each other and how to feel comfortable in our community. So there are both formal and informal norms. So formal norms are represented by well-established and written rules. So things like laws and regulations, student handbooks, employee manuals, no smoking or no loitering signs. These are all examples of formal norms, things that are so ingrained in society or in the community that they are going to be written down and communicated to everyone in the society. On the other hand, you have informal norms. And informal norms represent more casual behaviors that are generally and widely conformed to. So we don't need a sign in a parking lot that says don't pick your nose in public. It's more of a general understanding that you shouldn't do that according to social norms. So informal norms are learned by observation and imitation, and they dictate appropriate social behaviors without the need of explicitly written rules. So things like handshakes, waving hello, table manners, or standing in line at the grocery store to wait your turn are all examples of informal norms. They're things that we've learned over time just by being in communities and observing the way that other people communicate and act toward each other. And over time, we've kind of learned and incorporated these more informal norms into our daily lives. So one sociologist named Harold Garfinkel developed what he called the breaching experiment. And he came up with the breaching experiment because he wanted to kind of show how important informal norms are to our daily lives. So during his experiments, Garfinkel deliberately imposed strange behaviors on unknowing people, and he then observed their reactions and responses. So the experiment was to see how other people reacted when someone, quote, breached an informal norm. If you've ever seen the show Impractical Jokers, they often, quote unquote, breach informal social norms in order to film the reactions of unknowing bystanders and for a comic purpose. But say, imagine you're the only person sitting on a bus and someone else gets on. There's maybe 40 to 50 empty seats on that bus in different rows, but the person that gets on sits directly in the chair next to you. That would kind of breach, we have social norms, especially in the US, of personal space. And if you're on an empty bus and someone else gets on and sits right next to you, for most of us, that would seem kind of weird or not normal. For instance, you would wonder, why is this person coming to sit right next to me, even though there are 40 to 50 other seats on this bus? So that's an example of a breached informal norm. Or imagine you're walking around on campus and another student that you've never seen or met walks up to you and asks if they can try on your shoes. That would be considered kind of strange, abnormal. You might be taken aback by that request. So both of those are examples of kind of breaching those informal norms. So formal norms can also be referred to as mores. And mores represent norms that embody the moral view and principles of a group. So the strongest mores end up being protected by law and formal rule books. The strongest mores end up being written down, so everyone is held accountable to them. So some examples of violating mores would be abuse of children. So these are cultural and social rules that have strong moral views undergirding them. So obviously, abuse of children has a strong moral implication. Incest, infidelity to your spouse, or polygamy, failing to pay your debts, committing a murder, stealing or harming someone else's property, public nudity, violating the speed limit when you're driving, or drug abuse and drunkenness are all examples of violating these mores, these formal norms of society that are undergirded by strong moral beliefs. On the other hand, informal norms can also be referred to as folkways. So we have mores and folkways. So folkways are norms that don't necessarily have any moral underpinnings. Folkways dictate what is and what is not appropriate behavior in the day-to-day expressions of a culture. For example, a folkway is knowing when to and when not to give a handshake, or when to wave to someone or not wave, or a high five or a hug. And some examples of violating a folkway are failing to send a thank you note, picking your nose in public, not respecting somebody else's personal space, chewing with your mouth open, talking to yourself in public, or not holding the door for someone behind you. So these are more informal norms without really moral beliefs undergirding them. They're kind of just ways that our society has over time learned how to interact with one another. And if you violate them, it doesn't mean you're necessarily a horrible, immoral person, but it will cause a lot of discomfort to other people around you. Now, symbols and language. Symbols like gestures, signs, objects, signals, and words, they help people to understand the social world. Symbols provide clues to understanding experiences by conveying recognizable meanings that are shared by society. So some examples of common symbols are sports uniforms and logos, or company logos like the Facebook F, and traffic signs. Some symbols convey different meanings depending on the society that is interpreting them. So for example, the thumbs up symbol in the United States means approval or success, but in Iran or Iraq, the thumbs up is interpreted as an obscene or rude gesture. In India, the thumbs up signifies that something's not going to work out. And in scuba diving, the thumbs up means that the dive is over and it's time to swim to the surface. So depending on what society you're in, the same symbol can have very different meanings. And even the destruction of symbols is symbolic. So effigies or statues representing public figures are often burned down or dismantled in order to demonstrate anger at certain leaders. For instance, in 1989, the crowds tore down the Berlin Wall, a decades-old symbol of division between not only East and West Germany, but also a symbol of the division between global communism and global capitalism. And so even the destruction of that symbol was itself symbolic of kind of that end to the Cold War and the end, essentially, of communism or global communism. So one symbol that's common to all cultures is language. either transmitted verbally or represented as a set of symbols that have been written down, like letters and characters, that when you combine the symbols, they represent words and phrases. So even when a culture shares a common language, rules for speaking and writing can still vary by region. For example, do you call a carbonated beverage soda, pop, or Coke? Do you call the insect that flies around in the summertime with a glowing rear a lightning bug or a firefly? Or do you call your evening meal dinner or supper? Furthermore, regional dialects and accents can vary so much that at times people who are speaking the same language to one another may find it hard to understand the other person. For instance, imagine a Bostonian with a thick accent conversing with someone from New Orleans. So language is constantly evolving and changing in line with changes that occur in society. For example, last year in 2019, 530, quote, new words were added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And some of those words were deep state, vacay, escape room, aphantasia, dad joke, colorism, and the word they was defined for the first time as a pronoun to represent individuals who don't identify as he or she. So that's an example of actually a material culture, the dictionary, changing in line with non-material culture or cultural changes in society. And then we have the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis at the bottom. And this hypothesis claims that we can only think within the limits of the language that we speak. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis argues that language shapes our very thoughts. Different languages have unique vocabularies that represent different levels of refinement of concepts. In other words, language can restrict our own conception of reality. Because if we don't have a word to express maybe what we're feeling, then the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is saying you can't actually experience that feeling because you don't have a word to express it through or communicate it to other people. So essentially, this hypothesis argues if a person can't describe their experience, that person is not having the experience. For example, Inuit tribes in Greenland, Canada, Siberia, and Alaska have over 50 different words to describe snow, whereas English speakers have only a few, like snow, snowflakes, sleet, slush, ice, hail, and icicle. So you can see an American English speaker would kind of, in a way, be limited to express what kind of snow they are experiencing because we have a lot fewer words for different kinds of snow. And you can see in that graphic on this slide some of the different kind of words and descriptions that Inuit societies have for snow here. Now, many societies make a distinction between what we call high culture and pop culture. So high culture represents cultural experiences and attitudes that exist in the highest class segments of a society. So high culture is often associated with intellectualism, wealth, and prestige. And some examples of high culture would be going to the ballet or the theater or a symphony, which obviously, if you've ever tried to buy tickets to any of those kind of high cultural experiences, you know that they can be pricey. So by very definition, you need to be on the wealthier end to afford these kinds of cultural experiences. On the other hand, we have popular or pop culture, and pop culture represents the experiences and attitudes that exist in mainstream society and that most people can afford. So pop culture is known by and accessible to most people, and it's often spread via some sort of commercial media, whether it be the radio or the TV or the movie screen. Some examples of pop culture would be attending a community parade or going to a baseball game or the movie theater or watching a reality TV show like The Masked Singer or American Idol. Now, a subculture is a smaller cultural group that shares a specific identity within a larger cultural group. So a subculture is represented by racial or ethnic groups that share food, customs, and language of their heritage. For instance, Southerners could be considered a subculture, along with Chinese residents of New York City's Chinatown, or residents from Cuba that live in Miami's Little Havana. Some subcultures are united by shared experiences rather than shared heritage. So some examples of that would be motorcycle clubs that get together once a week to ride together, or critical mass bicyclers, the body modification community, Alcoholics Anonymous, survivalists, LGBTQ plus community, gamer culture, sports fans, the military, and religious denominations like Protestant or Baptist or Catholic. So all of those represent kind of these subcultures that are formed via shared experiences or hobbies or leisure activities. So members of one well-known subculture in the US are known as the Parrot Heads, and Parrot Heads are the loyal fan base and subculture of Jimmy Buffett lovers. If you know that song Margaritaville is by Jimmy Buffett, and most of his songs are pretty similar. Another example are Grateful Dead fans who travel across the country along with the Grateful Dead, and they call themselves the Deadheads. So that's another subculture. And the link on this slide right here will take you to a short little video. It's like 2 minutes long. It gives you a little bit of a glimpse into that life and subculture of the Parrot Heads. Now that's subculture, and the important thing to keep in mind is that a subculture doesn't question the larger society, and it still thinks of itself as part of that larger society that it lives in. That's important to note because a counterculture is a type of subculture that rejects some of the larger culture's values and norms. A counterculture might actively defy the larger society by developing their own rules and norms to live by. So some well-known examples of countercultures are the hippie movements of the 1960s, the Amish, anarchist collectives, and cults like Scientology or the People's Temple. And if you don't know what the People's Temple is, the video on the bottom right here will give you a pretty good idea of what the People's Temple was. In short, it was a religious cult in the US in the 1970s, I believe, late 60s, 70s. And if you've ever heard the term, don't drink the Kool-Aid, that term comes from the People's Temple because eventually their leader, Jim Jones, instructed them all to drink Kool-Aid and commit mass suicide. So, cults like this obviously are giving their members new rules and norms to live by and actively defying larger society. Now, another example of a counterculture that's not as terrifying as the People's Temple is this link at the bottom of the slide, and it'll take you to a short video that looks at a countercultural community that named itself Slab City. And this community of outsiders lives outside of San Diego, California, and calls itself the, quote, last free place in America. The people who live there don't put very much emphasis on jobs, they don't pay taxes or rent, and they reject many of the cultural values that most Americans hold to be sacred. But they've come together, they've somehow found each other, and formed this little community with their own forms of organization and solidarity and their own beliefs and norms. Now on this slide, we're going to think just a little bit about cultural change and globalization, and a new term probably for you, diffusion. So it's important to note the key difference that sociologists make between the term globalization and the term diffusion. So globalization refers to the international integration of trade and finance markets, as well as the facilitation of the flow of goods across borders. Globalization involves increased communications and air travel, which facilitates the flow of information and people across borders. Diffusion, on the other hand, refers to the spread of material and non-material culture and the integration of international cultures. Diffusion is a result of globalization. So please watch this TED Talk that I've linked to down here at the bottom of the slide. In this video, international businessman Peter Alfandre gives a lecture titled The Myth of Globalization. He makes the case in his lecture that globalization does not lead to diffusion. To say that another way, he argues that just because global markets and communication are more interconnected and speedy does not mean that we are becoming one big homogeneous world culture where everyone has the same values and norms. And he shares in this speech several of his personal and business experiences while traveling the world to defend his argument. So he's saying that cultural norms and social norms across the world are very strong and very deeply ingrained, and at least at this point in time, the fact that we have globalization does not mean that everyone's the same and we're all becoming one big global culture. He says that each society is still very distinct in terms of their ways of thinking and acting and believing and interacting. So watch the video and ask yourself whether or not you think globalization is creating a single homogeneous world culture, or do you think globalization is bringing more cultural diversity to different parts of the world? And think about the many different ways that culture is disseminated or communicated, and how is that affected by globalization? And lastly here, before we conclude today's lecture, let's take a step back and think about how those three sociological paradigms or perspectives would think about culture. So the structural functionalist perspective would assert that societies need culture to exist. Cultural norms function to support the fluid operation of society. We need norms to help us interact with each other and thrive. And cultural values guide people in making choices that are acceptable to the community, which will, of course, help your community continue to function well, which is what a structural functionalist is all about. Now, conflict theory perspective would claim that culture reinforces issues of privilege for certain groups based on sex, race, class, or a number of other divisions in society. So a conflict theorist asserts that inequalities exist within the culture's value system, that certain values benefit certain groups within society more than they benefit others. So therefore, a society's cultural norms benefit some people but hurt, silence, or ignore others. Some norms, both formal and informal, are practiced at the expense of other people. So that's your conflict theory perspective. And then our symbolic interactionists, who are much more interested in how individual people interpret and create meaning. So this perspective would interpret culture as being created and maintained by the ways that people interact and in how individuals interpret each other's actions. Cultural is very dynamic and fluid and always changing, as it's dependent on how meaning is interpreted and how individuals interact when conveying these meanings. So those are your three theoretical kind of perspectives on culture. I just wanted to bring those in at the end just so you don't forget about those three paradigms, and we'll come back to the three paradigms in every lecture. And by the end of this course, you'll have a good idea, a firm idea of what each of these perspectives means to sociology. So that is it for today's lecture on Chapter 3 on culture. And please email me at kadams@columbustech.edu if you have any thoughts that you want to talk about concerning today's lecture, or any questions and you need any clarification on anything that I've talked about or discussed today. And I hope y'all have an excellent week, and I hope to hear from y'all soon.